G'day. Here at the Regenerative Journey, part of our goal is to educate our followers on the benefits of knowing where their food comes from and the knock-on effects this can have on our health, our environment and our future generations. Understanding the connection has never been more important, and in the spirit of this endeavour, we have teamed up with Highland Beef Pastoral Company, a grass-fed beef supply chain servicing the growing US grass-fed consumer market, who I'm excited to announce are our Season 6 show sponsors. Essentially, this Australian-based business places cattle on their member graziers' properties at no expense to the farmer and provides competitive returns for every kilo of beef produced, allowing their graziers to focus on improving their businesses in a capital-free and risk-free environment. Highland Beef graziers are some of the best grass and animal managers in the country. Livestock are humanely and lovingly cared for while on their farms, and customers are guaranteed a very high-quality, regeneratively managed grass-fed and finished product with full transparency from farm to plate. If you're interested in finding out more about this program, visit hbpastoral.com.au/Charlie Arnott.
We sort of need new recipes now that we're grappling with the reality of planetary boundaries, that we can't keep pushing Mother Nature beyond what she can handle. I mean, we see her hemorrhaging. I mean, just drought being declared in England. People in Glasgow, 35 degrees,
Sweltering.
And we're seeing this is costing lives around the world. And I often think, farmers know this so much more than anyone because they're living it every day.
That was Katherine Trebeck, and you're listening to The Regenerative Journey. From wherever we are, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, recognising their continuing connection to this land, its waterways, the stars in the skies since time immemorial. We pay our respects to the elders, knowledge holders, and to all the generations of First Nations peoples who have nurtured their unceded sovereign lands for over 80,000 years and continue to do so today.
G'day, I'm your host Charlie Arnott, an 8th generational Australian regenerative farmer. And in this podcast series, I'll be diving deep and exploring my guests' unique perspectives on the world so you can apply their experience and knowledge to cultivate your own transition to a more regenerative way of life.
Welcome to The Regenerative Journey with your host, Charlie Arnott.
G'day, welcome back to the Regenerative Journey. I find myself here again in my little office area at the farm at Byron Bay. Excuse me if the chair creaks and the trucks drive past and the magpies tap on the window and that sort of stuff. I've actually got a window now. I had it fixed the other day. It broke. Moving on. Introing Katherine Trebeck this week. But before I go there, I'm just going to have a little chitty chat. Haven't organised myself too well this morning, to be honest. But I do want to read out a couple of the wonderful, as I did last week, wonderful not testimonials, are they? They're just sort of nice things that people will say on the podcast, reviews and that sort of thing. This one from, that's my phone going off. That's a bit naughty. The Regenerative Journey touches on the lives of the farmers, consumers, animal welfare, planet and place for which we live. A tapestry of interconnection and a breath of fresh air to listen to when one needs a boost. The ecosystem of life is heard in the wise words of all the guests who share. I cannot recommend this podcast enough. Thank you, Charlie, and all the guests. This one, the Doherty chat above all is brilliant. That'd be Darren Doherty. I can't remember what episode it is. It might have been season 3, I reckon. Amazing, lovely guy. I know he sat there in his cafe there at Castlemaine, and in a funny little storeroom. He's very, very patient to let me move a few things around. And we had a massive chat there. Refreshing to hear a trainer speak openly about how, for success, you need a bit of everything. Another one here. I hope I haven't read these ones out before, but look, stiff shit if I have. This might be the first time for you. Love this and admire Charlie and all the guests. This is regen and holistic approach is vital for our future. What else do we have there? I know. Some feedback. Please, Charlie, cut down the episode's length in future and allow the guest to talk without cutting in so much and contributing. We want to hear them, not you. Episodes should be under 40 to 50 minutes in length. Keep up the great work. That's interesting. Well, that's a bit of a feed forward from Luke, and thank you, Luke. I appreciate it. I hadn't seen that. So that is good. Look, I don't know if I necessarily agree with you. I think I tend to get more feedback saying that, things seem to be okay in terms of the balance, and I've been pretty conscious not to cut. I don't know if I cut people off. I think I jump in when I think there's an opportunity to contribute in a meaningful way. But nonetheless, really appreciate the feedback there, Luke. Wonderful podcast with so much useful information. As someone with chronic conditions caused by modern farming practices, I love this podcast and am inspired to find ways to support regenerative farming to help our climate, the environment and our health. Well done, team. Look, that's probably enough blowing the proverbial up myself. Might just turn that phone off. What today? Look, it's this episode is going to be coming out probably close to Christmas, actually. You're probably all in amongst the wrapping papers, or whether you've eaten your turkey, or I'm not sure quite where the date of that's going to be. I can have a quick check when I have a bit of a shitty chat, but I think that what is this time of year? What does it mean to you? Is it something that Is it something that actually inspires you? Is it something that sort of gives you, 20th of December, this is coming out, so it's just before Christmas. Are you a bit over Christmas? Is it too commercial? Is it, I was talking to someone the other day and they just said, I just don't like Christmas. It's just, it's the chore, it's the visits, it's all this sort of stuff. I mean, there's every angle to see the same kind of concept. For some, it's just the one opportunity for all families to come together and gather and have a lovely time. I don't sit on the fence on that one. I don't mind Christmas. I'm not generally the one who's doing all the organising, so it's probably a bit of an easier gig for me. But it is an opportunity. It is a juggle, especially for families who 1 year you go to your parents and the next their parents, and kind of it's always that consideration. We've always been pretty decisive with how we do it. I do know that was it last Christmas or the Christmas before, might have been, we were supposed to have it with my parents in Sydney, but we were in Melbourne beforehand, and then New South Wales got shut down and the border got shut, and we pretty much had a last minute Christmas down in Melbourne, which is wonderful, and we made up for it, of course. But yeah, no, I don't know. Mixed emotions, I think, this time of year. It's minutes to Christmas, isn't it? I'm recording this in early December, and there's a heightened sort of sense of urgency now. People are kind of anticipating some time off, but God, I don't know anyone who's not sort of scrambling to get all their jobs done before they knock off. Is there anything else contemporary in the world that I want to talk about? I did get a few thank yous for touching on the foot and mouth issue and in previous rants. Don't know where that's up to, the mRNA vaccine. Talking about that stuff, I did actually note with some joy in the last couple of days that it had been any mandates, I think any health-related government sort of health-related mandates for employees, staff and so on had been dropped, which is an interesting thing that's finally happened, and what that will mean for other industries. Sort of, as someone made a comment, it's sort of hard to have rules for one industry and not the others, and I don't know where everything else is up to, but just pleased that is that's the case. And interesting also that I was just talking to a fellow this morning who's got a good angle on all things, talking about how 18 months ago the mainstream media was banging on about how horrible it was these protesters were protesting for freedom, and they deserve to get shot with rubber bullets. The memorial at Melbourne near the Botanic Gardens there, and they should have been locked up and all sorts of stuff. The mainstream media went nuts, and even Koshy's saying, what do you do when your unvaccinated relatives turn up for Christmas? And it was just horrible stuff. Anyway, I noticed in the last week, not that I've been told, I've seen a bit on the socials because I don't watch mainstream media, as a rule, the same people from the same mouths are now saying, oh, isn't it horrible what's happening in China? Good on them for protesting against the government tyranny and their lack of freedom and getting locked up and all these mandates and their zero tolerance. That's horrible. It's like, are you serious? Were you not saying that 12 months, 18 months, exactly the same thing, but well, in reverse, like 180 degree? Fascinating. I find that fascinating. The same people, the same mouths saying totally the opposite thing with as much conviction and earnestness. It's really interesting, So moving on, Katherine Trebeck. She presented at the RCS conference a couple of months ago now, July, in Brisbane, and she had a fantastic presentation. I asked her a question about because she and this was not a criticism by any means. She was talking a lot about sort of government, not intervention, but a government influence, or the role that the government could play in sort of creating a wellbeing economy, which I don't disagree with. But I also was keen to understand, and also make the point that I think these things generally come from community. Governments follow in the footsteps of. I don't know they're necessarily leaders. I wouldn't call many politicians leaders at all. But my chat with Katherine was fantastic. Did it at the Botanic Gardens. It was in the morning before I spoke to Walter Yana, who's now out and about in his episodes released recently. We had wonderful chats about sort of wellbeing economies. The sort of I guess not the irony, but kind of the way that a country's economics and or success, the GDP, gross domestic product, is, basically it's not a very good measure of wellbeing. In fact, it doesn't measure wellbeing. An interesting thing is a case in point there is that, the prison industry and the illness industry contribute to a country's GDP, So she talked a lot about her role with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and, how can we sort of talk more about the humankind index, including that, how do we sort of, and she's written some fantastic papers, that's all in the show notes as well. And just some really good yarns about her role or what we can do as communities to improve the wellness of our countries, basically, and how we measure that and how we make that a really relevant and pertinent thing to focus on. It's not just all about the economics. It's not that we forget about economics, but wellness contributes to the economics of a business or of a world, of the country. Lovely chat with Katherine. She's now Canberra-based. She was in Scotland for many years, had a few yarns about that. But I hope you enjoy this interview with Katherine Trebeck as much as I did recording it for the Regenerative Journey. Katherine Trebeck.
Yep.
Welcome to the Regenerative Journey and welcome to the Dixon Room here in the Australian National Botanic Gardens in Canberra.
Thanks, Charlie.
We're looking at, I believe you've been here before as a
kid.
As a little girl.
Yeah, and as an auntie with my little nephews, but not recently. I haven't been in this room, and it's a lovely sunny vantage point. No,
unless you're a staff member in trouble or on the board, I guess you probably haven't been in here. We're lucky to.
Little secret courtyard.
I know, it's great there. I was actually, because Michelle was in here the other day and she sussed it out, and was kind of hopeful that the day might improve and I might do something out there, but I think this is great. We still see the view. For those who haven't been to the Botanic Gardens here in Canberra, it is amazing. I've only been here once, to be honest, truth be known. I've been to the Arboretum a few times, but it is wonderful. I'm meeting Walter Yana, or Yana, depends. I have to find that
how best. Yana at the conference where we met,
yeah.
But that may not be the correct. He'll tell you, won't he?
I better. I'll make sure. Walt, who's a legend. So he's done a lot of work here, and that's why we're sort of here. And Katherine, so that's why we're here at the Botanic Gardens in Canberra. Apart from the fact you're from Canberra, so that was going to work out really well. I generally interview my guests in their happy place, like on their farm, in their garden, their place of work. This isn't necessarily your happy place. I guess two questions. Does it make you happy, and where is your happy place? If we were to be interviewed anywhere in the world, if I was to interview you, anywhere in the world where you would be looking out upon something that made you happy, where would that be?
Oh, love that question. So one, very happy to be at the Botanic Gardens, so this can go on the list of my happy places. But I have many happy places. So I've just come back from Scotland, and there are many, many happy places there, usually looking up at a big, massive mountain as the clouds whip across the vista. But for a long time, when you do those sort of quiet meditations at the beginning of a meeting or something, and people often say, think of a place that's peaceful. For all that time I'd been overseas, I so often would think about a particular little gum tree up on Red Hill behind my parents' house here, and that looked out over Canberra with all the beautiful valleys and the mist and the hills, but also the city beneath. So I guess underneath a gum tree on a hill in Canberra, no matter which hill it is, no matter which gum tree, but that's probably my criteria for a happy place.
Well, we weren't too far, we're geographically not that far away, because Red Hill's on the other side of the Lake Burley Griffin. I understand that it was actually Walter's... is
that his namesake?
Walter Burley Griffin.
Yeah.
His wife actually did a lot of the architectural design of Canberra.
She's done well.
But he got the cred.
Yeah,
probably a
as
sign.
Often happens. With architects too.
How rude.
Yeah.
That was a bit of Canberra trivia there. So I'm glad that's great, and that wasn't a setup. We are under kind of a few gum trees here, and not far from, so that's awesome. Katherine, as I did quickly give you the heads up there just today about the regenerative journey, it's all about your regenerative journey, and I often and a lot of people use regenerative in the context of farming. Now, you're not a farmer.
No.
And that doesn't matter.
Okay, good.
Because it's about regenerative living, regenerative life, and that I kind of assume that most people, certainly the ones I interview, are on a regenerative journey of sorts. Whatever that means to them. So where do you want to start? You mentioned before you grew up in Canberra. Do you want to start there? At what age are you comfortable starting
You
at?
can go back as far as you want.
What hospital were you born in?
Oh, I was born in Canberra Hospital, where now the museum is.
On the point out here, on the lake. That was a hospital.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, so much.
Did they convert the old hospital, or did they knock it down and build a new?
Oh, it's actually, there's a little tragic story there. They imploded it, and being Canberra, that was a big event for the city, and they'd had people lining the shores of the lake. And I think I wasn't here at the time, I was at Melbourne for uni, I think, if I'm getting my years correct. But I think there was a competition on the radio for who got to push the explosives. And what happened is the explosion didn't go well, and debris flew out. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think a little girl was injured and fatally. Horrid for what could have been such a fun, beautiful day, and here's going to be a new era for this building and this location, and just tragic.
Wow.
Tragic. So that's that. I was born there many years before that. But it's now this beautiful museum, and it seems to have a really good exhibition on at the moment called Connection, about Aboriginal connection to country. And I'm hoping to go. I haven't been able to go yet, but hoping to go, with loads of beautiful imagery and sound and lighting.
Well, as I was saying to you before, my family are in Canberra today, so they're going to go there, and before they pick me up this afternoon. So that's fantastic that's on. I did see a dinosaur. I was telling you that Lord, he's all about dinosaurs, and I didn't say dinosaurs, I said animals alive and dead, but especially the really old ones like pterodactyls he calls them. So he'll be thrilled to see that this afternoon. So you were born there before its demolition. What happened? Where were you living? What were your interests as a girl in Canberra? Were you happy?
I loved growing up in Canberra. Yeah, and in hindsight, Canberra gets a bad rep, doesn't it, from a lot of people? I think less so now, but in hindsight, it was such a privileged cocoon of a place to grow up in. You know, I went to a school that, you know, I was really happy in and had great friends and loved just being able to cruise up the mountains and the local ones, but then also down to the Snowies and easy distance to the beach. And you know, my family's always had sort of links to farming, so out to various farms, one particularly in West Wyalong, so for a while. So, you know, flat landscape. And
did you go through Burrawa on the way to West Wyalong?
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
That was the most important question.
It's all about, it all starts with Burrawa, doesn't it? Yeah.
Thank you. I keep telling everyone that.
Yeah, and so, yeah, really, really very conscious of that privilege, actually, of growing up in Canberra. And then, you know, as often people do, did a gap year over in the UK and then came back to Melbourne for my uni. And that was fun, different. I felt like a bit of a country girl in Melbourne, but enjoyed that too.
And your family in Canberra, were they they had careers here, and why Canberra?
Yeah,
were they from Canberra? Or was
they're
it kind
Sydney-siders, but they moved here for work just before I was born. So I wonder if I was probably one of the first sort of generation of people who, you know, of settlers who, you know, because Canberra is often people come in for work and so on. So, but being born and bred in Canberra is, I'm quite proud of that now.
Special. Yeah. It is actually pumping. We went to, we got here yesterday and stayed at a hotel or apartment block, and it's really like smarty pants buildings going up everywhere, cafes. We went to Messina, plug for Messina, in Lonsdale Avenue, I think it is, in Civic, Braddon, that's right.
It's very trendy now.
And they were saying that, I was pumping last night, on a Sunday night, and they were saying that Messina is the busiest of the lot, and they've got them in Bondi, there's in Sydney and Darling. There's a few of them. I could not believe it. And that was just out the door in winter in Canberra, the queue.
That's brilliant.
For gelato. And then I know they are bloody tough here, these ACTarians, Territorians.
Do you know the other thing I'm loving, which I don't know why I hadn't appreciated it before, but pretty much from every street or path or park you're in, you can see mountains. No matter where you are. And
that's Mrs. Walter. This is Mrs. Burley Griffin.
Yeah, her spatial design. And I'm loving that, because having come back from Scotland, where I crave those mountains. And I lived in Glasgow, so the centre of Glasgow, and I could see some mountains. But here, and I don't know why I hadn't appreciated. I mean, I've always appreciated the sort of bush capital thing. But my God, it's awesome. Almost every street you're in. What
are the ones called? I should have
Brindabellas.
Brindabellas, that's right, because it's Brindabellas. The Brindies for the locals, because I know there's Brindabella Airlines.
William. You can use the nickname.
You have to live here for 30 years to do that. Where did we get to there? Oh no, gap year. Your gap year. Was it in Scotland?
No, I wish.
Where was it?
It was in Kent, in England.
Oh, lovely.
I was that ubiquitous sort of rent-a-roo teaching sport at a school there, and that was fine.
The proper gap year.
Yeah, you do it to get your Interrail pass and cruise around Europe. But that's where I first went to Scotland, and it was towards the end of that year, and it really struck me. It felt like going home, and that was quite confronting, because I'd been to all these beautiful places in Europe. I'd been to Ireland. Going to Scotland felt like going home, and to be really honest, I was a bit embarrassed about saying that for a while. It felt like, I don't know, some American person. Yeah, my ancestors are Scottish, and it was actually many, many years later, talking to an Aboriginal woman that I was working with, and she said, well, but if that's where your people are from, then no wonder.
So they are.
And but way, way, way back. But it somehow, her saying that legitimised that sense of place and that sense of home that I felt in Scotland. So, yeah. So
is Trebeck a Scottish name, or is it
Cornish? That's Cornish. But my mum's Menzies, and there's McClellans and Camerons, but it is way back.
Yeah.
Yes, but Scotland's also. Anyone listening who's been there or has Scottish roots or has watched Rob Roy or Braveheart will know it's a special place, and happy to chat all that's going on there at the moment. The politics is firing up. It's likely to be an independence referendum in the next couple of years. So, but it's got. The people are so funny, and I think there's a real commonality almost in humour and laid-backness in the Scots and Aussies, if I can make those sweeping statements. I felt very settled there.
Well, there's no doubt that a lot of Australia, the convicts and, the first white settlers here, we don't even know if they're the first ones, do we? The Dutch and God knows the Portuguese and God knows who else was Dirk Hartog and who knows where that all started. But certainly the convicts that came out here, they were obviously European and I guess they were Irish and Scottish and Welsh and English.
Oh, and some of the governors, Macquarie.
Yes.
And, they did...
was Macquarie, was he a Scot?
I think it's a Scottish name. I don't know.
Yeah.
I should have learnt studying my primary school history. But, and that's, we can't romanticise the Scottish role. They did a lot of damage,
totally.
Some of them. But there are sort of those long century-odd roots of Scots, being shipped out or being part of that frontier, invasion activities, right through. I hear Scottish voices on the radio here now too, which is really nice. I'm just reading the sport or the health report or so on.
It's a great accent, isn't it? We love it. I know my wife particularly likes Scottish accent. No, I can't do it. But my family, Lomond. So there's Loch Lomond up there somewhere, not in Scotland. Loch Lomond.
I'll check it out.
It is. There is. I'll tell you. I haven't been. I don't think I've been there. Maybe I drove past it.
Loch Lomond, you mean?
Lomond.
I thought...
Lomond.
I was thinking all French.
Is it L-O or L-A? Well, we've got a bit of French in there. Lamont. Well, see, that's where it gets a bit hazy because... and there was also Lamont as well.
But Loch Lomond is... the one...
Is it L-O or L-A?
L-O.
It is O-L. Yeah, well, I think that's...
Yeah, Lomond. And it's beautiful. So it's right... It's the big loch outside Glasgow, so I know it well.
Is that the way you're saying the water comes from? No.
Near there.
No, near there.
A lot nearby. Ben Lomond, which is the sort of big mountain nearby, is the southernmost of the Munros. So it means a mountain that's over 3,000 feet high. So beautiful part of the country.
And there's Mum's family came from Glenshee, near Bally.
Up in the grew up near Aviemore,
Glenshee.
Cairngorms.
Yeah, I drove there years ago. Skiing, that's right. Yeah, I saw that and went to the cemetery and tombstones and all that sort of. It was beautiful, and then farming there, and then for many generations. Farming up that part of the world, and then my dad's side a similar kind of and French, and anyway, long story, not about me. So let's go. So did the gap year? You came back. You said you went to Melbourne.
Yeah.
Uni. What'd you do there?
To Melbourne.
Studied.
Arts. Yeah, did Melbourne Uni.
Did you study?
Yeah, loved it. Yeah, do you know? And actually, I think having had the year off, I was really excited to study again. I think if I'd gone straight from school, I just probably would have wanted to party, but I kind of did that in my gap year. So yeah, I head down. So I studied and then went on and I did. It's funny how these sort of, looking back at it now, how these sort of doors open and opportunities happen, and in hindsight, how they all make sense, but maybe you just feel that's interesting on the time. I ended up doing a bit of, instead of sort of pulling beers to make my spending money, I ended up working at Rio Tinto, just in their they had a student room, so press, helping with the press clippings, that sort of thing.
This is in Melbourne?
In Melbourne, yeah. And I got really interested. This was sort of the late 90s. I got really interested in what they were doing around their Aboriginal relations work and what they called at the time corporate citizenship. And so I ended up...
Well, that's refreshing they were doing it back then.
Yeah, they were back then.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about all the dynamics because it was really fascinating. It was quite heartening. There were some incredible people there at the time. And so I ended up doing my PhD back here at ANU, so just up the road. But it was looking at Rio and its relationship with First Nations communities around 3 of its different mine sites or prospects.
For your PhD?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was sort of asking this question, this idea, because it was in political science, so I was asking this idea of democracy, it means power to the people. In the government is so absent in some of these localities, the big powerful entity is the mining company. How could Aboriginal people exert influence and get the mining company to change its ways or undertake certain behaviours? And so I was looking at Jabiluka, with the sort of uranium story up in Kakadu. I was looking at Century Zinc Mine up in Cape York and out in the Pilbara. And really different contexts, but very, very different requests, I guess, if I can use that word, from the communities around their mine sites. In some locations, they're like, nope, we don't want you here. Others, there was a difference between younger and older generations about whether they wanted the mine to come in. So really, really complex. But fascinating to see how government pretty much bent over backwards for the miner to come in, changing legislation, running around the world on diplomatic missions, trying to get the UN to change, listing Kakadu National Park as in danger, all sorts of things. And it was this, it was power that these communities could mobilise through a combination of protesting or sometimes physically blockading, going to shareholder meetings, linking up with unions or environmental groups, and fascinating time. But also really saw how a couple of individuals in those companies who really got the importance of talking to communities and working with communities. And they almost had brought that from their gut, and then they could marry that with saying this is sensible for business. So that's when it really worked. But yeah, as you've hinted at, I think Rio has maybe changed a little bit since then.
Because it was them who blew up that
the gorge.
Yeah. So it was last. Was it late?
Yeah,
it was. Didn't take long.
Yeah, I haven't been following it closely since because I've been away. But yeah, I mean, this is such conjecture. I don't think it would have happened in the years I was looking at Rio. Yeah, but I mean, Rio's got a history. That midnight oil story. Beds are burning. That's about one of sort of Rio's, earlier iterations in the 50s, burning down. Up in Camalco, an Aboriginal community up near.
Really?
So for the bauxite up in Cape York.
So back to the government there. I think you just said that the government were kind of helping move these companies into these areas. So that was an active kind of a thing? Because obviously there was
examples. So I mean, obviously native title laws had come in, and there are heritage laws as well. But there are examples where government was offering essentially to override or renege or repeal some of that legislation. You also had the government at the time with the Jabaluka case essentially saying to the communities, the Mirarr people, that you've got to let this mine go through because you need the royalties for roads, breakfast centres, primary schools, the sort of stuff that growing up in Canberra you just take for granted as a right of citizenship. And so it was almost you have to.
It was a blackmail on the way.
Pretty much, yeah, and then
you can say it, blackmail.
Yeah, and they were. I mean, it's sort of substitution. It's called, substituting mining royalties and mining provision of services for what basic rights of citizenship that government should provide. So really problematic. It
was dressed up as essentially, without saying it exactly, that if you don't, you're not going to get those. You get those basic human.
It was almost that explicit. Yeah. That explicit. And so in localities around the world, often miners are providing those because they need healthy workers eventually and educated workers. So there's a rationale they can justify. But for the community up the road that doesn't happen to be sitting on an ore body or says we don't want mining here, what happens to them? So it's really fraught in terms of role of government and also corporate power and government power. But actually what we saw is the mining company saying, you can give us the legal licence. We also need the social licence, which I noticed was a term that's still in use here and was talked about quite a bit. That idea of the social licence to operate was talked to quite a lot at the conference where we met a few weeks ago, which is really telling. And so I mean, I haven't been following Rio since, but there was instances where you had the company saying, all right, we know we need to sit down and figure out who to speak to and understand demands and figure out our role in meeting those demands.
Isn't it interesting that was back then in the late 90s, as you said, and there was a level of consideration and consciousness about that by the sounds of it, and then that clearly was rewound at some point and gone backwards, especially because it's not like the last 2 years that people talk about social licence. Like there has been a steady, I would suggest, from the 90s, incorporation of Indigenous, conversations and permissions and at least contributions to whether it's mining or a road going through it, whatever it happens to be, that's actually, there was a regression within Rio. I guess that might be, I guess it's the people in power that go, no, that's a load of bollocks, we're not going to bother with that?
Yeah, I don't know what happened in terms of key individuals leaving. I mean, that was one of the lessons, actually. You can have all the policies in the world. It comes down to individuals. Mm. So whether it was key individuals leaving or, I don't know, different context, or I haven't followed it up. Others, I'm sure, will have studied it and will have hypotheses over what went on.
And government too, I guess. Change of parties and prime ministers and ministers, and it's like then things just sort of get taken off the table or put back on. So PhD, so Melbourne, Rio, PhD back in Canberra with Rio. So was that a formative kind of study? The whole, the Rio thing and the touch points with the Indigenous culture and kind of, did that set you up for things, or that was a bit of a departure from your plan?
Yeah, never had a plan. It's more, hey, that's interesting, dive deep into that. Because after I submitted the PhD, I went off to Scotland, and people were saying, well, hang on, you've done this work here, and now you're heading off to Scotland. And actually, some of the patterns were really similar. I mean, I didn't go to Scotland for work. I've never been someone who's sort of moved for work. I thought, here's where I want to be. And at the time, I was, having gone to Scotland in that gap year experience and really felt connection, and having gone back since for a uni semester, I thought, no, I still haven't got Scotland out of my system. So I thought, got to go. So this was 2005, and some of the commonalities there around that. So often that confluence of corporate power and state power, community connection to the land. I mean, particularly, up north in Scotland, around the islands, very, very strong connection to the land. And also, folks being at the forefront of climate change as well, where there's some islands that people might know of, the Uists, so the South Uist and North Uist, and they are so flat. And they are, these are crofters, so tiny farms.
I want to get back to the crofters, but sorry.
Well, and they're just seeing the impact of rising sea levels, more ferocious weather. It's coming onto their farming land. It's ruining their crofts, and so just some of those patterns, obviously very different in one sense, but some of the patterns were, and I often say, when you hear similar stories from different locations, but you hear the same sort of story again and again and again, that's when you know something systemic's happening. And I think that started to plant some of the seeds. And there are a few other moments in the work I try to do now, is really looking at some of the systemic structural causes of the challenges facing the world today. And I guess I've never thought of it that way in a way, but those patterns between Australia and a place like Scotland and the UK really feed into that. Scotland. But I'd been, funny little diversions that happen. I'd spent a couple of months working in Cameroon during my uni time as well, and that also made me think. I had been wanting to do community development, and I was also really interested in sort of global trade stuff. I thought that would be fun because I just had a cool lecturer at uni. Yes, so often that's what it takes.
Make all the difference, doesn't it?
Yeah, having an awesome lecturer. She's an awesome woman working on global trade. And then in Cameroon, I just sort of spent this time in a village trying to be helpful at a hospital there, probably not being particularly helpful, but making friends and spending time with this tiny village. And when I got back to Melbourne, a few weeks later, I got word that village had been decimated by a flood. And so my instinct was to just go back, get on a plane, go back and do what I could to help. And I happened to be doing a course at that time with a woman who was teaching, I think the course was along the lines of human rights in Southeast Asia. And she was an activist and academic from East Timor. And she said to me, don't be so stupid, because, you're this white girl, you'll get in the way. And my sort of reaction was, but I'll go and fill sandbags or something. And she said, no, you're here at uni, get as much education as you can and work on why that village was vulnerable. And at the time, I don't think I really clocked how significant that bit of advice was. But, as I was saying earlier, the privilege to be able to have that education and to then be able to deploy it, to look upstream and look at, some of the systemic causes of why communities like that one in Cameroon, like the crofters in Uist, why communities in Australia are having to trade off, having mining come in on a sacred site to get basic rights of citizenship. Some of these things are, have their roots in the same story.
Let's get back to the crofters, because that when I was over there 20 years ago, one of the trips I did over there and stayed with some people at Isle of Skye, and they had a large estate there and beautiful, amazing. And they talked, the first time I heard about the crofters, and they had a number of crofters that were on their land. And from what I understand from back then, they had been there for a long time, and their families had intergenerational kind of crofting, if that's the word, and that there was things were not always, and I only got one side of the story, from the estate owner's point of view, pretty or good, in terms of tenure, and who deserved to be there, who should be there, who shouldn't be there, how long they, kind of could stay around, and their rights as crofters. And it struck me as a really interesting system, because it doesn't sound like it's like in Australia you've got a land owner, that's the official kind of way to put it, and they're a family generally, and some corporates, and then they work the land. But over there it's a bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Scotland is profoundly unequal in terms of its land ownership, and there's a debate that's really brewing about that at the moment, and I won't get the precise figures, but it's something like 400 people own something like 90, I mean, the stats will be wrong, but it's of that magnitude, 90% of Scottish land.
Wow.
Queen being some, but there's a guy called the Duke of Buccleuch, there's a guy who's a very, very rich person from Denmark who's trying to rewild stuff. So huge inequality, though, in land ownership, and people are really saying this is at one of the roots of some of the other inequalities in Scotland, and also questions of power that come into that. So crofting's been around for a while. I'm not an expert in it, but there's laws and protections for crofters, but it's a pretty tough life. Tiny plot of land. I mean, and crofts themselves, the buildings are tiny little. We'd call them, I guess, huts here. But it's a really important way of life for a lot of people. And so what you're seeing is this legislation sort of coming in that's quite starting to protect and give them a bit more rights. But it's not something I know tons about to speak authoritatively on.
Are they... so generally a lot of the land's owned by other people who may be absentee. Is the crofters have like a lease? Is it like a century-long lease?
It's passed down through generations, but I'm not solid on the facts around the crofting. Just
while we're on them too, you mentioned sort of structural challenges, in terms of you mentioned Cameroon there, and what are some of those structural challenges? I mean, it's a very broad question, because I guess Scotland may be different in terms of some of the detail to Cameroon perhaps, but what are some of the, let's just call them issues that you are seeing, that you saw there, and you said you're trying to sort of work on now?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that really fascinates me is when we look at various challenges that communities, individuals, countries, the world are facing, and you sort of try to sit back and not just focus on some of the symptoms and how they're playing out in an immediate sense, but when you try to look at what are the causes, what's going on behind this. There's a lovely phrase that comes from an expert in health inequalities. He says, what are the causes of the causes? A guy called Michael Marmot. And so when we sort of look upstream, I often say we need to channel out in a 3-year-old. Often 3-year-olds are always asking, but why? We need to do that. And so not just take at face value what's going on around the world, and just try to figure out what's behind it. And there are deep roots, colonisation, patriarchy, all sorts of things. But for me, the way our economies operate, how they're designed, who's winning, who's losing, what sort of economic activity is celebrated, incentivised, what sort of economic activity is not even counted as important, different sort of business models, how that flows on to infrastructure and energy and all those and how we grow our food being an important part of that. So to me, this big piece of the story is the economy. So it's not everything. So I'm not saying unilaterally the economy is absolutely everything, and there's deeper questions you could ask about why the economy is the way it is. But for me, until we really start to grapple with changing our economic systems, we won't have a fighting chance in dealing with the challenges we're facing today. Can put Band-Aids on them. We might be able to address some in isolation through interventions or what I'd say is sort of ultimately, if we're honest, downstream treatment, rather than dealing at source with some of the challenges. And the economy can be a huge blocker to progress as well. So that's a space I try to occupy and question really, and ask, just reflect on what is it about the economy that needs to shift, and why is it designed this way? And there's a whole lot of discussions there.
So what can we? I've got a lot of questions. No, this is fascinating. I don't know where to start. Let's just keep going with that one. So what are some of the changes to the current economic systems? I don't know, the top three that you feel need to take place, and whether it's site-specific, in a country, or it's just general, doesn't matter where you are in the world, there's some serious changes that need to take place. What are a couple of those?
So one is, I think we need to actually shift our mindset. So this isn't something I could say to a government minister, here's what you need to do next week. This is how we think about the role of the economy. And I think I used this image actually, you probably remember the sort of 1990s sustainable development discussions, where you saw sustainable development talked about as three pillars: social, environment, economy. I think those images are probably some of the most dangerous images in the world, because what they suggest is that the economy is on a par with society and the environment. And actually what ecological economists, what feminist economists have been telling us for decades, and of course what First Nations communities have been telling us for millennia, is that we need to understand nested systems. We need to understand that the economy sits within society and the two sit within nature. You cannot push the economy beyond what the natural world can handle, and the economy is a function of how society is operating. So that sort of shift of understanding the economy as something that needs to be in service of what I describe as higher order goals, rather than a goal in its own right, is a mindset shift. And it's easy for me to just say that, but it's quite a profound shift of how you think, you think about hearing the way the economy is just discussed in the media, or political promises around the economy. It's, we've got to have a strong economy. We have to grow the economy.
Growing.
And often the proxy for growth measurement is a really flawed measure of GDP, and we can talk about that. But we have designed our economies in a way that they're designed for and dependent on economic growth. And there's so much evidence that our planet can't handle that anymore. And also, it hasn't done a good enough job in delivering what people need either. I mean, we still see, despite economies that have been growing for the last few decades, marginally, and it's getting harder and harder to squeeze out growth out of the economy. We're hearing economists talk of the risk of secular stagnation. So even on its own terms, it's starting to fail. So we my point is, we sort of need new recipes now. Now that we're grappling with the reality of planetary boundaries, that we can't keep pushing Mother Nature beyond what she can handle. I mean, we see her hemorrhaging. I mean, just drought being declared in England. People in Glasgow, 35 degrees,
sweltering.
Yeah, and we're seeing that this is costing lives around the world. And I often think, farmers know this so much more than anyone, because they're living it every day. But so we've got to stop reaching for those recipes that we were used to last century. And sometimes that's going to be exploring and experimenting with new ways of doing things, because there is no blueprint that we can pull out of the drawer and just press go on. But there are some lessons, and there are chinks of what I describe as chinks of light. Communities around the world, businesses are undertaking the sort of practices that we need more of, that we need to grow those sorts of activities. And there are some governments too that are grappling with these questions in in patchy ways. None of them have yet done this in a really properly systemic way and across the whole piece. But there are some really good examples, I think, of different governments that are starting to undertake the sort of shifts that we need, that will start to build towards what I'd describe as a wellbeing economy, essentially an economy designed for the wellbeing of people and planet.
Let's do that then. What are some examples of governments that are doing, you see them doing great things, being a benefit in the right direction?
Well, I mean, I think some of the shifts we're here in Canberra, shifts towards public transport's a good example. Moving away from cities that are designed for cars and for petrol and consumption to cities that are designed for communities to hang out together and get there on public transport or walking. So, infrastructure design. In Scotland, which is the place I know best at the moment, really good examples of things like they've got a whole government agency called Zero Waste Scotland, and its job is set up to really inculcate this idea of the circular economy. And there's lots happening here in Australia on the circular economy as well. I suspect your listeners will have lots of examples that they'll know of or probably be involved in themselves. But this government agency saying we want to make sure that the way production and consumption is done in Scotland is circular, not linear. And so they're supporting all sorts of changes, investing in business innovation, supporting the pioneers that prove it's possible. And there are governments around the world have got what they call wellbeing frameworks. So these are, I guess, dashboards that set out a goal for government and have a whole lot of metrics underneath it to start to measure progress in a different way, to broaden out, I guess, what's on the horizon or in the inbox of politicians when they're making decisions. So it's not just, how's GDP moving or how's the stock market moving, but they have a much richer suite of information at their hand. And they, often they've had that information for a while, but it hasn't been given the preeminent, sort of the eminence. Is that the word? The profile in their decision making as some of the more traditional economic metrics, such as GDP or raw employment figures. We don't often talk about the quality of jobs as much as percentage of unemployment or employment. But we need to ask, what sort of jobs are they? Are they allowing people to put food on the table? Do they have dignity and purpose? Are people feeling that they're bullied at work? And did they give people enough time to spend time in their community and care for their family? So we need to sort of ask those more qualitative questions about our economy. And so I often say we need to be fair weather friends of economic growth rather than its ever faithful followers. So we need to think about what sort of growth, in what direction, what circumstances and where, rather than just this sort of the rate of growth and narrowly focus on that.
Well, the GDP, I can remember you might have touched on it, and I've just keep hearing it. It's fascinating. GDP takes in everything, including basically the economics of the prison system, and a lot of other very a lot of economics and money tied up in some not so pleasant industries that all contribute. And so it's like, do you throw it all in? We got our GDP's growing, but as you say, I guess the quality of that growth and the sort of who gets impacted and who doesn't it's really it's a pretty outdated measure, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was. In a way, I feel sorry for GDP because it's and the sort of image I have.
like it's a thing.
Yeah, it's the image I have. It's kind of like a shoe that a foot that was too big for it has been pushed into, so it's bursting at the seams. It was never designed to give us a sense of how well a country is doing. And its creator, Simon Kuznets, famously said you cannot tell the welfare of a country by just looking at GDP. So what was different, slightly different terminology.
Who was that? Sorry,
Simon Kuznets. And so it came out of trying to essentially assess the impact of Roosevelt's New Deal in the States. Then the war happened, and it became really useful to understand, spending on war and how governments could grapple with what they could spend on. And then after the war, a whole lot of UN institutions were set up, and GDP became embedded in that through the national accounting system. And you had in the Cold War era, you had the Western countries saying, look at our GDP, and the Soviet countries saying, well, we have our GDP. It was all about how do we grow bigger. And then our geopolitics is so often designed around GDP too. The G7, the G20, all those global groupings and the power that goes with them. Voting in the IMF and the World Bank and so on. The entry ticket to those clubs is how big's your GDP. Yeah. And as you say, and I think it's really important to think about, GDP will count some good stuff going well. So, for example, if there's more renewable energy being built and the wages being paid to workers and that what they then spend in their local community, that will be add to GDP. But also if one of them crashes their car on their way to their job and ambulance gets called out and they have to get a new car, that will also add to GDP. And so what's bound up in it is these sort of really perverse incentives. And, to go back to our 3-year-old, so often I've heard 3-year-olds say, why would you want something that's gross? I mean, and I think that's really, really apt because it scoops up in it the good, the bad and the ugly and calls it all good. And so we get this sort of misleading sense of how our country's doing. But, of course, it's so stuck in people's minds of, GDP's gone down slightly. You'll have the media in a frenzy saying, is Australia heading to a recession?
Recession, terrible.
And in a way that's not unreasonable because so much there's this sort of structural imperative, like, employment will be related to that because we've currently got a system that's dependent on it, taxes and so on. So this is hard. It's not as simple as just replacing GDP. We need to have actually a wider conversation about how we think about the economy and pull it away from growth orientation. And I guess the point is that conversation will be harder if we've still got GDP as our compass.
As your reference point. What was I going to bloody say then? GDP... there are alternatives. I mean, famously, Bhutan has the
gross
national happiness.
Yeah, and Bhutan's had that out since 1972, same year that the Limits to Growth report was published. Interestingly, and it's in a way I have this very Western definition of happiness because I wish they didn't call it happiness because it's actually really rich. 9 domains. They have things like time use, how cultural vitality. It's a really cracking measure of progress. There's heaps of other alternatives. The UN's got the Human Development Index. OECD has something called the Better Life Index. There's no shortage of people having a go at an alternative. Yeah. And in a way, I don't think that's a challenge anymore. It's more what's underneath that conversation. Are we prepared to think about our economies in a different way and think about the economy in service of what people really need, rather than having it as this sort of goal in its own right, and we're there to, serve the economy and the environment's there just as an input into production. So it's sort of a more deeper conversation that I think we need to grapple with, which sadly makes it harder. It was easy as just flicking out GDP and bringing in something else. Yeah,
a prescriptive kind of way of doing it.
Looking for more information to assist your regenerative journey? Come join Charlie and his guests around the kitchen table, an online community of supporters with exclusive access to the Regenerative Journey interview transcripts, live online Q&A sessions, a chance to engage with other like-minded people and more. Go to www.charliearnott.com.au/the kitchen table. And if you're not totally satisfied with the value of your membership and wish to cancel it within the first 2 months, we will give you a full 100% refund, no questions asked. Now let's get back to this week's episode.
Just talking about, back to the question about government and what they're doing, what I do note is, alarmingly, I have to say, just because I don't know where that's all going and kind of what, I don't know if the full kind of picture's been put on the table, is the tracking of emissions. Now, you might be aware, in Ireland recently, I believe, the agricultural community there, the farmers have been, I'm not sure how they're going to roll it out, taking out 1 million cattle out of their system, right? Because the simple way to I won't say justify that, but the so-called logic of that is, if we have 1 million less cows farting, it's going to save. That's a whole lot of emissions, like methane primarily, that is going to not be happening, and that's going to be a good thing for the planet. Okay, and I've got a real problem with that because. And that's why, Walter, and I'm going to be interviewing him this afternoon, his take on whole methane from a very scientific point of view blows the lid on the whole methane argument about methane's killing the planet. And so with that in mind, the removal of those animals who are, when managed well, actually help sequester carbon because of their grazing, and they're removed from that. So there's a whole lot of there's an opportunity cost of that, not having them in the system. And Irish people aren't going to stop eating meat.
No,
they're going to go. They're going to eat all lamb, so they're going to get it from somewhere else. And so there's going to be emissions being sort of generated to get the meat to the people still. So there's sort of, it's an interesting. It's a really good example, I think, of there's a problem. What's the solution? Cows are farting, let's get rid of them, when there's so much more to it. And I'm just kind of really interesting to get your view on that, but also, that's just one example of where this is heading, and there being documentation of and calculation of people's emissions, and not just farmers, but as a consumer. I go and, one drives a car, they buy groceries, there's emissions attached to the growing of that food, and and that being a starting point for a real lack of sovereignty for people, where they're going, oh my God, I just need to live, and now I'm being taxed for the emissions. Again, in a very isolated, there's a problem, this is a solution kind of thing. Have you noticed that? Are you concerned? Is there? What do you think about that?
I think what I'd say to that, not being a scientist, and I defer to the likes of you and Walter for the detail, but it's hard to think there's much better than local and seasonal, rather than shipped in plastic. And whether that's shipped in tofu from China, but it's wrapped in plastic and all the emissions that go with that, versus something that's reared or grown and harvested locally, and of course seasonally. I think that is one of the problems that rich consumers around the world have got accustomed to expecting being able to find anything they want out of season, because we're this buffet way of shopping. We're so used to, we want a full table full of anything, and I'm just going to get this, but I want the choice. And I think there are some really exciting developments, around encouraging people to eat more seasonally. Restaurants are really embracing local produce. So I think that, to me, is you can't get a better rule of thumb than local and seasonal. And I'm not brilliant at it, but I do my best. You said something. You used a couple of words that I think are really applicable beyond just the cattle methane emissions example. You used the word managed well, and I think that phrase applies to the question around growth as well. There are some parts of the world, probably some parts of Australia, that will need more growth, and the evidence is that at lower levels of economic development, to use those phrases that I'll critique myself, but to countries that do not yet have enough need more. And the question is can they use that growth to invest in collective institutions, school systems, health systems, and so on? And when they do, you see that the returns in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality going down, literacy rates, etc., going up, those sorts of good things that matter for, I guess, what we might describe as social progress, they follow GDP. But those returns start to tail off at sort of relatively middle-income country stage, and so this sort of points out, it's a question of how are we managing it well, and what sort of growth in what circumstances, and moving away from this sort of blind faith. Economic growth is the solution to everything. Roll it out, everything will be fine. We can just read across all the problems of society or problems of the environment. We need more growth because we need more money to invest in cleaning it up. It's this sort of crazy circular logic. It's just admitting to ourselves that some countries have got to the point where they've arrived. And this is sort of the title of a book I co-authored a few years ago, that maybe countries like Australia and
the economics of arrival.
Yeah, maybe we've arrived. And so and again that sort of comes back to that phrase you use, managed well. What does it mean to make ourselves at home? It means to manage well, and that actually is the original meaning of the word economics is household management. So if we're going to think about managing well on our planetary home, that's not just push down on the accelerator, turn a blind eye to the collateral damage that it does. It's thinking about what sort of economy do we want to take care of our children and our cousins around the world. And that's a very different conversation. And again, one of the things I want to mention is that I'm really heartened, because it's hard to stay optimistic sometimes, but I'm really heartened by what's happening in certain businesses who are just saying, we have to be commercially viable. We have to, survive as a financially successful business. But that's not the point. We're doing that in order to be able to be part of the solution. And so whether it's businesses that are part of the circular economy movement or the sort of regenerative farming, I mean, farmers need to be successful. They need to keep their head, food on the table and wash their face financially. But they're doing so for much deeper reasons. And it fills me with hope, because I think then you're starting to get coming together, these pioneering governments. You're starting to get businesses and you're getting communities who are sort of waking up to some of these discussions. And, it's hard not to feel hopeless at the moment, given the news that, we're all hearing at the moment and the impact. And, we're seeing the planet hemorrhage before our eyes. We're seeing that people dying around the world because of that. And we're also seeing still, there's been growth in Australia over the last few years. We've still got homeless people sitting in, doorways in Canberra, one of the richest cities in the world. Those recipes.
Is it?
Yeah, per capita. And, it's
really?
one of the most privileged,
Wow.
And, in one of the richest countries. So those recipes haven't delivered for enough people. But what I try to hold on to is that hope that there is work happening everywhere, actually. Maybe not yet adding up to enough, but it's maybe getting there.
Well, who benefits from there still being homeless people in the streets, and who benefits from still, the current system that's in place, the economic system, and who benefits from, the status quo, or not even a status quo? It's actually like, the ramping up of, a lot of the, I guess what the indicators within the GDP, what makes it up, and kind of for people to, that divide of income and wealth, who's benefiting from that? I mean, maybe not individual. If you know them individually, great. But I mean, what's the incentive for that? Just for some, for that to remain?
It's a really good question, and I guess there's a couple of levels. I mean, there's the sort of apparent benefit, and then there's if we really take a good hard look, is that really benefiting? So folks who are embedded in this current system, you could include all sorts of industries, advertising, fossil fuel sector, car sector, folks whose livelihoods depend on those industries. Quite, understandably, will be thinking, well, hang on, my livelihood depends on this work. Why would I want to change that? But we've got to meet that question on a human level and say, okay, well, that's a collective response is needed to that nervousness. I mean, a big debate in Scotland at the moment is around North Sea oil, and so many people there whose livelihoods depend on extracting more out of the North Sea. But they're also saying, we don't like these jobs. There's been research done interviewing North Sea oil workers. They're saying it's insecure work. It means big chunks of time away from our families because it's fly in, fly out sort of set of work. They would love to have a pathway that they could walk away from it. And so I think that's a societal response is needed, rather than just lecturing them or saying shut them down now. We need to tend to that very real, very human, very natural, understandable reaction. And so I guess that sort of points to the two levels. Folks whose livelihoods depend on the current system, of course they're going to, think, well, hang on a minute, I'm not quite ready to throw this away without something else. But then there's also that North Sea oil example also points to, but are they really benefiting? Are they really happy? Do they have the sort of lives that they want? And so often when people are given a chance to sit down and just take a breath and think about what really matters in their life. It's not having the fanciest, most expensive, trendiest kitchen or the most up-to-date trainers. That stuff matters for social affiliation, of course. But when people say what really matters to them, wherever they are in the world, actually, you so often get responses along the lines of health, relationships, being able to be outside in the natural world, dignity and purpose. And then you've got to ask a question, is the economy geared up to deliver those? And so I think those of us who are working on economic system change, of which I sort of count myself one of, a huge, diverse, rich mosaic of a movement, of which you and all, regenerative farmers are also part. I would say I think it behoves on us as a movement to be able to have conversations that, one, excite people about the possibility of a different way of doing things, but also show why it's possible and point to the examples, but work with government and policymakers to help make those pathways steady and secure. So we're not asking people to chance it all. But that's why, a lot of people talking about the narrative of this really matters. So,
do you think that above the say the fossil fuel industry, who, dare I say, probably not excited about electric cars and things, and maybe they are, because they think 100 years ahead, and that's kind of, they're gearing up for that at some point. Is there anything? I haven't been too far down the rabbit hole here, but to me, there's a sense of, there's the industries, there's a fossil fuel industry, there's the other ones, and is there a level of whether it's government or banking, finance, or a group of people that sit above all that and going, I don't want anything to get better, because I actually like the fact that all these minions are doing stuff that I'm benefiting from, whether it's, via different industries or whatever. Is that somewhere you've gone?
Yeah, so there are, I think if we're really honest, there are some industries that almost profit from our collective failure to keep people safe and well and healthy and protect our planet. There are plenty of industries that make a shed load of money from whether it's anxiety treatments or cleaning up after an oil spill or preying on people's insecurities to sell them more stuff. I don't think it's the conspiracy, that might come on a Netflix film, for example, of folks sitting around the room plotting. Though, I don't know if you've ever watched a little film called The Lightbulb Conspiracy.
No.
It's a fascinating little film where it says light bulbs initially lasted a long, long, long time. Then light bulb manufacturers said, oh, hang on a minute, this isn't good for our profits. No. So they all teamed up.
I don't think it's a conspiracy, is it?
Well, they teamed up to design light bulbs that didn't last.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing now with the shift is, there's this really famous example, Philips, the electricity company, who are saying, okay, you don't actually need the light bulb. What you need is light. So they sell units of light. It's really cool. They call them lux, little units of light. And so this is the famous example, Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, where Philips isn't selling them light bulbs that they then have to get the people who work at Schiphol Airport to replace them. They'll say, we will make sure the airport is lit. And so it's their incentive to have longer life, because then they don't have to send people around to replace them. And that's the shift from access rather than ownership is part of, I think, this shift in mentality. And we're seeing that with people, renting scooters.
I've seen them around camp. I drove one round Michael Gooden. Thank you very much for that, shouting me the ride from the conference back over the bridge on the Sunday night.
Yeah, so sharing, that's a tiny example of sharing ownership, or, co-housing, or there's a cracking little tool library here in Canberra that I'm trying to encourage my husband to use, so he doesn't need to go out because we have to do some renos.
Oh, you go and borrow power tools?
And
really?
He doesn't need to. No one needs to own a power tool, because don't. And cars. That's.
Oh no, men have to. Hang on, men have to own power tools. This is a thing.
Maybe not all of them though. But what if your mate
real
had a
men?
couple?
No,
and they had, there's ways.
totally. I get it. No.
And I think the young generations are sort of really understanding that their freedom is access rather than ownership, because it can be a pain in the backside to own a ton of stuff. People. There was a time, and I don't know if the statistic is up to date, but when I was writing the book, the statistic was that one of the biggest growth industries in the US was storage. So people had their big mansions in the US, but they had so much stuff they then had to pay for storage. I suspect there's people here who have a lot of stuff sitting in their house that they don't like or use, and it's they just delay it. I should take it to the salvos, but I can't be bothered. So just rethinking our approach to stuff and ownership is some of the questions we need to explore.
This is awesome. Tell me, Wellbeing Economy Alliance.
Yeah, which shortens to We All, which is kind of like a theory of change, actually. We all, but it'll only be by collaborating that we'll bring about the change we need.
We all.
Yeah,
I just see that written, and I didn't know.
So We All, I describe it as having many mothers. It's a global collaboration. It was set up just over 5 years or so ago from all sorts of different folk. academics who had been building the evidence base around the need for and the possibility of economic system change, activists, people working with government who said, we've been working on this question of how do we create a more humane, more sustainable economy. They'd all been doing that for decades, some of them, but in different, just disconnected way. And they said, there's heaps going on, there's heaps of action, but it's disconnected. So we need to link together. So we all was set up to try to, I guess, be that connective tissue, and in the hope that, one, it can nourish the movement a bit more, because this is hard, exhausting work, as you'll know, when you're going against the grain. It can be really tiring and lonely. So to be a bit of that, a space for people to come back to and know they're part of something bigger and feel recharged because of that. But also to really collectively push these conversations around, we need to rethink our approach to the economy. We need to kick, GDP into the 20th century dustbin where it belongs, but work together from doing so. We need to shine a spotlight on the pioneers that prove it's possible. And again, I just keep thinking those regenerative farmers that we heard about, and that you're one of, and you'll know so many more. They're the pioneers of showing this is what is possible. This is the direction of travel. We need more people to go in. So We All is very much about that. What's beautiful is that there's a ton of local hubs bubbling up around the world. I was part of setting up We All Scotland, but there's local hubs bubbling up in New Zealand, here in Australia, in South Africa, in the Netherlands, in Ireland, and Canada, and East Africa. It's wonderful. And they're all folks saying, we want to be part of this movement.
How does it survive in terms of funding? Is it volunteer? Is it a kind of commercial business? Is it not for profit? Is the government supporting that?
Yeah, so it's from a few donations, but also largely from philanthropic funding. So it's not a huge enterprise. The global team's about 10 people there now. I left back in March, but I'm still sort of affiliated with them. But I stepped away from being part of the core team back in March. So it's largely through foundations and so on. They don't want to get too big. They actually want to work themselves out of existence, and they've got a plan to do that. We all doesn't want to be around forever. Wouldn't it be great?
Yeah,
it's just the new way of doing things.
Done its job if it's kind of disbanded.
Yeah, and government. The question around government's a tricky one, because We All really helps government. We advise. I'm still saying we, aren't I?
You're never ex.
No, once you co-founded something.
No, that's right.
They advise government a lot. They instigated something called the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership, We Go, which is a bunch of governments who are trying to just learn from each other around how to put some of these questions and these ideas into practice in their economic policy making. So I think government, and the Scottish government now has an explicit purpose to create a wellbeing economy, and they do international diplomacy on the back of that. They don't give We All any money. Sometimes I think maybe they should, but then I think, it's great to be able to...
They benefit from it.
They absolutely do, yeah.
It's a bit rude.
Yeah, it'd be nice if they gave some no strings grant money, but not yet. I mean, it's still emerging.
Who's the just back to Scotland there in terms of the government? What is the state of the government there? Who's in power, so to speak? And because they were looking to, did they not have a referendum there?
They did back in 2014. So Scotland, if you think about it, it's a bit like one of the states here in terms of powers that are devolved, is the term they used a lot. Yeah. So it's still within the UK, but the government in Holyrood is the parliament. It's run by the Scottish National Party, who have teamed up with the Greens. So they're currently in power. They're in power, and it's a system that's designed not to have majority government. It's, the voting system and how the seats are counted. They want to discourage having majority rule, but together those two parties, who are both pro-independence, have got a cooperation agreement, and so they're talking about having plans for a referendum next year, probably October next year. UK government has said no, and so now it's probably going to go to the courts. And the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has said, OK, if we don't get the courts to figure this out, the next UK election we will badge and frame as a referendum. And the SNP famously has sent in the last few elections a huge number of members of Westminster Parliament, Scottish National Party, has sent a huge number of members of Parliament to Westminster. So there's this huge SNP block in Westminster. So they traditionally in the last few years, do relatively well. Traditionally it was Labor. They were, Scottish people sent Labor politicians down to Westminster. There's, I think, very few. I mean, in the past Parliament there was one Labor MP from Scotland. That's how much things have changed.
Is that sort of similar to Australia, where you've got Labor and the Nationals and the Liberals? Is there any sort of similarity there with kind of the politics of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very rough, crude read across with the Conservative Party and the sort of the Liberals here, and Labor Party and Labor in the UK.
Yeah.
But what mixes it up is this constitutional question. So in Scotland, you don't have the dividing lines are not Conservative Labor. They are largely around the Constitution. If you're pro-Indie or or pro-union is how.
Yeah.
And of course, Brexit messed that up, because in the 2014 election or referendum, a lot of people said that they voted no for independence because they wanted to stay part of Europe. 2 years later, Brexit happened.
Yeah, right.
Scottish people, about 62%, if my memory serves me well, voted to stay in the European Union. So now there's sort of this framing from government, from the SNP, from the Scottish National Party, is we've been taken out of Europe against our will.
Yeah.
Vote for independence, we'll get back into Europe. Now, of course, people are saying, hang on, it won't be that easy. So there's debates around that, but it's all muddled and messy. It's not politics like we used to know it.
How long have they been tied up with with basically a state of the UK? Like, is that how far are we going back there?
1745,
yeah.
And then that was Battle of Culloden, and then there was sort of the Act of Union.
Culloden,
so
that's right.
Yeah.
Did you watch the Outlander show?
No, I haven't been watching it, but I saw the main actor walking around my local street once, which apparently was quite exciting. But
he's quite dishy apparently.
Yeah.
We watched a few series, and then it sort of started going off a bit track that went to the States. But there was a great. That's why Battle of Culloden. I remember that because that was culminated in one of the end of the series. But it's a great history lesson.
Yeah.
It was kind of like, I said, I love having Scottish ancestry too. Going, that was really heartening to know that not all the news wasn't all good, but just kind of the way they lived, and I imagine it was reasonably true to type. I had another question for you. Your other book, Being Bold. Budgeting
report.
for children's wellbeing.
Yeah, big report. So,
it was a report, not a book.
Yeah,
a
big report. I was asked to
tell me about that one, because that sounds great.
So I was asked by, I guess, representatives of the children's sector in Scotland a few years ago, beginning of lockdown actually, who said they didn't understand the economics and the budget in Scotland, but they knew it really impacted their children's sector. So various organisations that are part of supporting children in various different ways.
Right. So education and
early years work and health and also, also.
And that they didn't understand how the economics of their industry or that works?
How the economy impacted them, but also particularly how the budget impacted them. And folks talking about wellbeing budgets quite a lot now, not least because of what's happening in New Zealand with a wellbeing budget there. So they said, well, could I help them figure out what a wellbeing budget for children might look like? And it's interesting they asked me, because I'm not from the children's sector, and I sort of said, well, yeah, but come on, children's prospects are influenced by their families' prospects, which are influenced by how the community, the labour market, the wider economy is operating, questions of inequality and what quality jobs are out there. You can't just focus on children alone. To me, that nested systems stuff. So I really looked at how can a budget help create a wellbeing economy, and what sort of, there's bits in it that are really techie and quite geeky, looking at how the finance minister in Scotland might want to rearrange how she does the budget. And I think there are some lessons for what might come out in October here in Australia, and what might become a future wellbeing budget here in Australia.
Is that on the agenda of the Australian budget?
Jim Chalmers is saying that October will be the first, will include some wellbeing components, and from what I gather, that's going to entail having some wider metrics within the budget document.
Who's helping them with that?
Treasury, I think.
Why you should be helping them.
I don't know. I think that's quite precise techie side of things that I'm not so the expert on, but colleagues are.
But generally, the philosophy of it or the intention behind it.
Yeah, it's a really great intention. And I think what they're saying is this won't be all singing or dancing. This is the beginning of a journey, which is great. Because I think what has to underpin this sort of shifts is a huge conversation with people so that particularly you get this mandate for those changes and you have a real sense this is what Australians want. So that report came out in March 2021 and it's essentially saying we need to rethink how we do budgets. We shouldn't just count as success how much we're spending on health systems because a lot of that could be a sign of failure. I mean, COVID times being an example, but in non-COVID times, the more people turning up at hospital, that means more people are feeling sick or anxious or they've been hurt. So we shouldn't just be looking at the spending and celebrating that. We should be thinking, how can the budget have a role in reshaping the economy? And to me, I think Scotland and probably Australia as well needs to have a conversation around using the tax system to encourage sort of behaviours we want more of. So maybe that means regenerative farmers have a tax breaks and those who are plundering the land have to pay more and start bringing in the environmental costs for some of those decision making. Maybe we need to lower taxes on worker cooperatives, for example, or social enterprises, but jack up taxes maybe on advertising that plays on human vulnerabilities. That's where the budget, I think, can really play a role in starting to redesign the economy.
I'm interested that the government don't seem to be I guess I'm a bit biased because I'm in it, but the government haven't kind of embraced the opportunity that regenerative farming presents for whether it's about emissions and carbon. I mean, because I'm generalising in some ways, less emissions because there's less use of products that would have emitted carbon in its production and transport and that sort of thing, but also in terms of the outcome of grazing, grazing well, that they haven't kind of got on board that more, and it makes me wonder whether, again, getting back to maybe so-called agendas or who's benefiting or not, that there's a lot of industry that, again, isn't that excited about it because it kind of erodes their own agendas, good or bad, Like I'm always fascinated about a lot of activists and vocal people, businesses, organisations who bang on about reducing emissions, which is great. But, there's a whole lot of the other half of the equation is, we feel there's a whole extra carbon out there than that was, or we've contributed to its emissions. There's it's one thing to reduce emissions going up there and continuing, but there's actually the carbon cycle is as important as it's not one way, it's not linear, it is a cycle, and there's so much more and more science around the benefits of grazing better and getting carbon in there. But I just don't know. And look, the government dabbles in the carbon economy. But it's just interesting they haven't really embraced it a whole lot more as a way forward,
So often governments are sort of racing to be second and not leading the charge. and maybe they need to feel it more. So maybe we need to have, cabinet meeting out at your property so they can feel what it's like. And then, tell them about the science that backs it up. But for them to get a real sense. Because I suspect maybe they just don't know yet. You're right, though, that there probably will be some vested interests are in their lobbying for protecting the status quo. And it also comes back, I haven't obviously tallied it up and netted it out, but the less you're having to pay for downstream remedial work on your land because you're keeping your land healthy by using natural cycles and agroecology principles and so on, that's not going to add to GDP.
No.
So if we still have this GDP lens, we can't celebrate what our planet really needs or what's good for communities. But invite them out.
Well, yeah, look, truth be known, there's plenty of farmers who are probably doing a better job than I am anyway, and probably have more data around what they're doing, which I think is really important. We're not flush with data. We kind of a lot of anecdotal and how we feel and how it sees and that sort of stuff. But in terms of the science and yearly monitoring of carbon levels and that sort of thing, but yeah, it is. You're right, and which leads me to my next question about, and I sort of half posed it to you when up at the conference there the other week, last month, was do we and maybe you've answered the question by saying they're rushing to come second. It's like, where are our efforts best placed? Is it just get on and do stuff like farming better, getting on and contributing to if GDP is still a reference point, and contribute to that in a meaningful way, however that looks, or do we sort of have to step in line with government and change legislation, to get them thinking to then allow us or give us some licence to do these things? Is there a bit of a guerrilla renegade kind of way to get things done that we should be probably not avoiding?
All of that's necessary. So we need that sort of work of just getting on and showing that it's possible, even if that means charting a course that's different to the mainstream way of doing things, because people start to look at that and start to think, what's going on over there? Maybe I can, they're getting something right. That land's looking great. What are they doing? And maybe I can pick that up. So just doing it differently really, really matters, because it proves it's not just desirable, it's feasible. But until we change the policy regime, so many of those good examples will be going against the headwinds. So there's also a role, and maybe it's for different people, to then work on the policy regime so it's more supportive of that sort of work. And then there's also the work around just supporting those pioneers, telling others about them, but using it to tell a different story about the economy, the bigger picture about, shifting away from the obsession with growth and towards an economy that's more in service of what people and planet need. So anyone who says one tactic is enough, I think's missing a whole 100 other tactics. And I think the key thing is for people to find what is it they bring to the party, and that'll depend on their skill set, their energy levels, where they are, what they get excited about. Some people will love protesting outside headquarters or talking, writing petitions to government, and that's so important. Others are happily building the evidence base and writing in scholarly journals and in books. Others are happy meeting within government and finding entrepreneurs within the corridors of power and supporting them. And then others, and I'd say perhaps most importantly, are those who are rolling up their sleeves and doing it. And that's what I saw so much of at that conference. It was just awesome. People who are saying, we're just going to get on and do it now because we don't have time to waste. I've actually mentioned earlier on what conference we're referring to. It's the RCS Convergence Conference, Convergence of Agriculture, Human and Planetary Health. It was 2 days back in mid-July. It was awesome and absolutely right. The examples of farmers getting on and just doing it, and doing really wonderful jobs. There was some farmers who presented numbers on what they're doing and their achievements, and then others are you just have to look at the photos and the video to kind of get a sense of what a wonderful job they're doing. And not just farmers there. Obviously, there was doctors. You had Dr. Zach Bush and Fred Provenza, and as a whole, it was just a lovely, wonderful thing. So I want to give them a bit of a plug because that's how we got to meet. We wouldn't have met.
We wouldn't have been having this conversation. At some point,
or a pub or something.
Yeah, at the top. At Woolfest, now that you're back in Canberra, Catherine, on the long weekend of October, Burra holds the Woolfest, and they have the blessing of the sheep. Brilliant. It's the Irish. They actually combine. I think they must have had two things. They had the Woolfest, which is a celebration of wool, and then they had the Irish festival. So now it's called Woolfest, and it's they get some thousands of people. They run sheep down the main street. The running of the wolves. Pamplona has the running of the bulls. We have the running of the wolves, and you can not buy a sheep, but you get a number, and if your sheep goes over the line first or so, I can't quite remember. But one year they just quick little story. One year they had the sheep all lined up. And it had been a really wet spring, and the dogs' feet, the guy who had his sheep dogs there looking after them to try and keep them on the road, they had really soft paws because of the soft of the spring. Anyway, and they weren't used to being on the bitumen. And of course, the dogs sort of bailed up, and the sheep went into the creek, and it was quite. It was a bit of a shit fight apparently. But there you go. There's an excuse to come across to come to Burra.
I'll check out if I can make it.
One last question before we do our Patreon little Q&A thing I mentioned before. I've got a few more, but I'm just conscious of the time. What are the risks if we don't change?
Oh, God. I think we're seeing the risks already. As we were saying earlier, our planet is hemorrhaging. And I think anyone who's not taking that seriously has got their head in the sand. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the suffering of people around the world, because we're seeing people suffer today because of what's happening to the planet. Scientists are warning that tipping points are being breached already, which means it's the chance to fix things is getting smaller and smaller. So I don't think that's over dramatic. I mean, I defer to the scientists, and that's what they're saying. But also, you marry that with what communities are saying who are impacted by it, and you marry it with what you see on the news. But of course, it's not just environment. There's a social side of our economic system too, and so it matters for communities and people and families around the world. So, I mean, that's at risk, and what the potential is having a much better life for everyone in a way that they're not stressed, they're not rushing about, they've got a sense of dignity and purpose, they've got enough to live on, and they're not worried about being flooded or bushfire, destroying their land or extreme heat where they can't go outside. That's what the potential is.
Well, the good news is that you're on board all that, and you're contributing in a very meaningful and positive way that we can achieve that potential. Katherine, thank you so much for your time here at the Australian National Botanic Gardens.
Mm-hmm. It's been fun, Charlie. Thank you.
That was fun. Our friend, who's the name of the lady who came in? Jo?
Roz.
No. Roz. Well, thank you. She talked about a fee, which I didn't know we were going to get hit up with. So hopefully that I can convince her that the promotion we're giving the gardens in this interview is going to be heard by thousands.
Come and visit the Botanic Gardens. Buy lots of coffee. That's
it. Lots of coffee. There's a cafe, a lovely cafe. And it is actually
great gift shop.
It is
a bookshop.
Lovely,
bring your wallets.
The lovely people, and it is a bit of a national treasure. As is Walter, my next guest. But Katherine, thank you so much for your time. We're going to do a little quick Q&A for our Patreon members. So if you want to hear the Q&A with Katherine at some point, then jump on Patreon, charliearnott.com.au, sign up, $10 a month. It's two coffees here at the Botanic Gardens, or anywhere that is, and you get a whole lot of cool free stuff exclusive to our members. Katherine, thank you. We're going to sign off and get you have a little wee break, and then back for 10.
Thanks, Charlie. It's been a lot of fun.
It's been lovely. I really enjoyed that. Thanks, Katherine.
Pleasure.
And next week on The Regenerative Journey, my guest is Jason Cotter. I knew Jason to be a chappie who's now pretty large in the Australian ancient grains kind of world, and that was the primary focus of our chat. However, I was thrilled to chat more about his time in Central Australia and being involved with sort of first contact situations there with our Indigenous brothers and sisters out there. His copywriting, just a fascinating yarn. It was like we spent so much more time not talking about grain, which was wonderful too, because it was a really balanced chat we had. It was a funny interruption in the middle of it, but you can look forward to that next week on The Regenerative Journey.
This podcast is produced by Rhys Jones at Jaeger Media. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to subscribe, share, rate and review. For more episode information, please head over to www.charliearnott.com.au.